Hello and welcome to the 19th video update of our What If interactive wargame campaign from here in Preston Pans. And I know it's not long since the last video, but events have been moving pretty fast in the wake of that Jacobite defeat at the battle outside Petersfield. So let me bring you up to date with the events that have taken place since then. Just looking again at the 18th century landscape where the battle has fought, the Jacobites had fought the engagement across here and then retreated this way to Clanfield. From there, they've started tracking west in the hope of searching for a way around Cumberland's position. Now, Cumberland's army had to advance into the field to fight. It had then had a pretty bruising engagement, and its cavalry in particular had taken quite a hard battering and were not in any shape, we decided, to march into these hills in close pursuit just yet. But we did assume that they would come through, occupy the Jacobites' encampment, which they will not have had time to take away with them. And then by the time they've sorted out all of those French prisoners that they've captured, and the men of Montreal's that they captured too, and sent the king back to London with news of their success, all of this would have taken them to the end of the day. So we're leaving the Redcoats initially in possession of the battlefield, and there they will remain, whilst the Jacobites get a bit of a head start. So let's look at those first crucial 24 hours. The darker blue line is the Jacobite retreat after the battle, getting them to Droxford before they feel safe enough to stop for the night. Then the day after is the lighter blue line that takes them to Winchester. As I've said, Cumberland and his army doesn't stray far from the battlefield itself until the day after the battle, when they march as far as Cheriton, deciding to go in parallel on the other side of the hills. It's obvious where the Jacobites will be making for. Looking at our helpful 1750s map of the area, we have the Jacobites coming up into Winchester, which they returned to on the evening of the 7th of April. And there is some discussion about whether they could mount an effective defence of the old walled town. The walls are still intact, although pretty decayed. They certainly wouldn't stand up long, though, to Cumberland's artillery, and reality is there simply isn't the time to organise an effective resistance here. They need to put some distance between themselves and the enemy pretty quickly. They decide they're going to head towards the River Test on the road to Andover, up the top of the map there, and as you can see, they've got the benefit of the Roman high road there and the road through Littleton to carry them there as well. By splitting over the two roads very close to each other, the two Jacobite columns will be able to cover more distance quickly. Crucial. So, as I say, this is the Jacobite line of retreat out of Winchester, up this way to Littleton and on the parallel road here. Cumberland is in hot pursuit, and he sends Henry Hawley ahead with the cavalry brigade. I'm just going to pause, though, just to pick out this rather convenient coincidence, the mark here on the 1759 map of a Hessian camp. This caught my attention and sent me down a little rabbit hole. It led me to this really interesting plan of the Hessian camp just outside Winchester from 1756. Pure coincidence that the Hessian force was here 10 years before in our campaign, a large Hessian force, of course, as part of Cumberland's army. The plan is very detailed, but basically, for those interested, there's sutler's stalls at the rear there, then a rear guard line, the officers' encampment, the private soldiers, and then the artillery park in the centre. Really interesting, and as I say, a pure coincidence that it happens to coincide with our campaign movements as well. Enough of my digressions. Back onto the campaign for 1746. We have our two parallel roads coming out of Winchester here that I've already mentioned to you, up which our Jacobite army will be in retreat. I want to point out another few features, though, in this landscape. There's the village of Littleton, a choke point, but also with a little church in it, a place with a few enclosures. There's also a large country manor here, which is still there as a country house hotel. There's a wooded area here, just off the roadside, another farm over here on the slopes of this big belt of high ground, which is topped by woodland, hedges, and so on. So potential areas of defensibility. Here is our Jacobite army then on retreat through this landscape, picking up those features again. Bottom left, the country house, the Norwood and adjacent farms, and the high ground at the top. And of course, the Jacobite army moving up the two parallel roads heading towards the River Test. The Jacobite army is marching in two columns, which have been divided between Charles Edward himself and Richelieu, who's taking the Roman road. And you can see the Prince's column here coming through Littleton village, past the church. What remains of the Jacobite cavalry has been sent forwards to secure the river crossings at the Test, and so they're quite a long way ahead of the main body in both columns, and that means that they're currently, at this point, out of immediate command range. The Jacobites were successful at Petersfield in getting most of their guns safely off the battlefield, but they are now encumbered on the march by their artillery and, of course, their supply wagons. And of course, just as they are moving into Littleton, on the Prince's column at least, the first appearance of Henry Hawley and the British cavalry appears in front of the rear guard. The rear guard comprising French troops. They at least have both superior firepower abilities to most of the Jacobite regiments, and they have the capacity ultimately to be treated as prisoners of war. So that makes sense for the rear guard to be comprised primarily of French soldiers. So, on the morning of the 8th of April, 1746, Henry Hawley and the British cavalry catch up with the Jacobite rearguard as the retreat begins from Winchester. It's going to take 6 turns before the British infantry under Cumberland himself are able to reach this spot, by which time much of the day will be exhausted. Can the Jacobites get their supplies, their regiments, and their guns out of the area and over the river so that they can be safe from immediate pursuit? Hawley has 4 regiments under his command. He has the Life Guards, he has the Blues, he has the Horse Grenadier Guards, and he has, formed up into 2 squadrons, the Hessian Hussars. Richelieu's column is somewhat taken aback to find the British cavalry so close behind, and the 4 of the column, led by Lord John Drummond, rushes forwards. One of the guns, and as you can see here, Townley's English Jacobites head up towards the high ground. Very successful initial order rolls for them. In fact, as Drummond is rushing the Jacobite forces up the road as fast as possible, Richelieu deploys 4 regiments as a rear guard, some distance back from each other, where they're not able to provide direct support if it comes to a hand-to-hand engagement, but they are able to provide cover if each is able to withdraw through the screen of the other. The danger is that it opens quite a large gap between the withdrawing supply columns and the rear guard itself. Drummond, though, manages to get his men so far up the road in the early turns of the game that he's able to come into range of his cavalry scouts. Strathallan's horse are able to be ordered back down the road to support the retreat. Meanwhile, the Prince's column has some success as well. It manages to get Ogilvy's men up to the high ground. John Roy Stewart's coming behind, although one of the wagons very stubbornly struggling its way through Littleton. Littleton village is a bottleneck. You can't get through there whilst deployed into line, and this game really is all about the success or otherwise of the order rolls, and if you stay in column on those roads, it's much easier to get yourself moving. The delays to the wagon mean that the Athol Brigade cannot get out, so it's deployed into line in support of Berwick's and Clare's, who are the rear guard proper. Sensing that there's the blockage in the village and that the best way to inflict disorder onto the Jacobites is by simply charging their rear guard, Hawley prepares to send in his heavy cavalry into the teeth, of course, of volleys from Berwick's and Clare's. The closing fire is effective. It does inflict casualties on both the Life Guards and the Blues, but they do close, and a furious action takes place just outside Littleton village. At this point, the Duke of Perth's decision to deploy the Athol Brigade into support seems a very sensible one. In the more open landscape on the high road, things haven't gone as straightforwardly for the British cavalry. The Horse Grenadiers have found themselves directly opposite the Royal Écossois. And if you remember from the Battle of Petersfield, these two really gave each other a good run during the course of that engagement. The Écossois came out of it very well. So maybe it was the memory of this that's just made the Horse Grenadiers stop short of their full charge. They are able to offer a very light return fire, though, towards the Écossois, but they have not decided to charge home. Meanwhile, though, and unexpectedly, the Hussars of the Hessian force have decided to come round the flank of the Jacobite column rather than charging straight into the rear guard of Lally's there. Eventually, urged on by Hawleys, the Horse Grenadier Guards do charge home, smashing into the Royal Écossois, but once again, as they had at Petersfield, that bayonet line holds. Meanwhile, Charles Edward has managed to get his Ogilvy's men up onto the heights where they've taken up position behind the hedgerows and trees there, which give them some cover. And he's also deployed John Roy Stuart's into line, which reduces the ease of commanding them, but means that there is a screen directly in front of the wagons and artillery as he withdraws those towards the river. And amazingly, both Clares and Berwick succeed in driving off the enemy's charge of horse. And as you can see, the Lifeguards has been driven back into disorder. And at this point, all seems well, except on the next turn of action, Clares, instead of withdrawing, roll a blunder, which obliges them to charge. And maybe it's the impact of this audacious charge, but as soon as they come into contact, the Blues are in fact routed by the charging Irish soldiers of Clare's regiment. A remarkable success, but one that has left the Jacobite rearguard split open and far too far forwards than it should be. Now, this really becomes a fatal error for Clares because the Horse Grenadier Guards, who've been driven back by the Royal Écossois, they take a bit of time to recover from that action, and during that time, the Écossois attempt to withdraw. This frees up the Horse Grenadier Guards to exploit the opportunity of charging the flank of Clare's regiment further to their left. Now, in the rush and confusion of this action, Richelieu's column has got into a bit of a mess. Some of its regiments have stayed in position far longer than they should have done. Orders have not been reaching them. The Hessian horse have got behind them, and Lord Drummond has been so successful at getting his Jacobite battalions off the field that there's nobody protecting the artillery and wagons that were stuck in the middle. So, as you can see, the squadrons of the Hessians have got into the back, and one of the supply wagons has been overrun, as has a battery of the French guns that were attempting to withdraw towards the high ground. Things are much more successful over with the Prince's own column. He has managed to get all his guns and the last wagon up the hill and along the road, covered by Ogilvy's men on the heights, covered by the hedges and trees there. And there's still so much distance between him and Hawley's men that the Prince is even able to bring John Roy Stuart's regiment back into column and get them moving too. Derwentwater's Dragoons have returned to the battlefield now that Lord George Murray has got far enough up the road to be able to summon them back to support the Jacobite withdrawal. Meanwhile, however, back at Littleton, the Duke of Perth was having a lot of difficulty trying to both command the rearguard and get the Athol Brigade moving up through the village. It takes the Prince returning to Littleton to be able to overcome that problem and get the Athol Brigade moving through the village at last towards safety. The withdrawal of the Athol Brigade, however, does leave no support for Berwick's and Clare's as they desperately try to cling on against the waves of British cavalry charges on the other side of Littleton. Berwick's are eventually overrun by the Lifeguards, And as you see here, Clares are driven back to the village where they are finally shattered by the charge of the Horse Grenadier Guards. The only good news out of this action from the perspective of these Franco-Jacobite units is that they don't have to be pursued to destruction. They do have the capacity to surrender as prisoners of war. Worse still over at Richelieu's column, because the total disorganisation of the retreat there has left Richelieu himself isolated on the road, and those marauding hussars have been able to charge straight over his position, cutting him off and taking him prisoner. The hussars do, however, find themselves isolated soon behind withdrawing Franco-Irish units. Here, Lallies are able to get up behind one of the squadrons and put a blistering volley into their rear. Likewise, the other Hessian squadron comes under a lot of pressure because it is charged from the rear by Strathallan's horse, who've come down off the high ground in an attempt to try and screen the retirement of Ruth's Irish regiment. The Hessians are driven off but not broken, and this at least provides the Jacobites with control of the road and a chance to get more of their men out of the fray. With the Horse Grenadier Guards distracted by dealing with Clare's regiment, the Royal Écossois have been able to withdraw far enough to be able to now come up and make sure that those Hessians are kept out of the fray, whilst behind them more of the Irish are able to withdraw up the road towards the heights. With some successful orders getting through and some order finally coming into what was Richelieu's column, Drummond there is able to get 2 more battalions up onto the heights and away, and the Strathallan horse able to screen them from the rear and get away as well. However, the Hessians are still in the field, pushing the Irish up the hill, and having come through Littleton and reformed, the British cavalry are now threatening the Royal Écossois. The last of the Irish regiments to try and withdraw out of the field is Lallies, but before they're able to get across to the road and out, they're charged in the flank by the Hessian hussars. And at that point, seeing the prospect of withdrawing diminishing, Lallies' regiment surrenders. And it's no wonder, because they can see over their shoulder that the Duke of Cumberland has arrived on the field, and his brigades of infantry are now starting to move up both roads behind the destruction caused by their cavalry. And as you can see here, Cumberland's columns are advancing, avoiding Littleton village and up into the open ground, with Husk's vanguard leading the way, and the Hessians coming up behind them too. The only Jacobite force still on the field is the Royal Écossois, which at the moment is still facing the threat from the British cavalry. And with cavalry to their front and massed infantry columns coming up to their rear, most of the rest of the Jacobite army safely away, at this point it's perhaps not unreasonable the Royal Écossois surrender as well. The Duke of Cumberland, arriving on the field, is well pleased with the achievement of Hawley's cavalry. They're able to present him with the captured colours of a number of regiments from the Irish Brigade, one of France's great brigades of infantry. This has been a devastating engagement. In fact, in terms of the military impact of the Prince's firepower and numbers, this has been far more devastating than the defeat at Petersfield. However, he has managed to get most of his army away. He has managed to get most of his supplies away, and apart from one battery that was lost, most of his artillery. Although the Prince's army is diminishing, it is still an army. In fact, the main thing that the Prince now has in his favour is the fact that he is so far from most of his men's home that there's going to be no likelihood of desertion, safety in numbers for the remaining Jacobite units. They have lost Richelieu, they have lost a number of their best French regiments, but nevertheless, they continue the retreat. They do reach Andover, that's the blue line reaching Andover here, and the following day they head off in this direction towards Berkshire. Cumberland, having camped outside Winchester, he moves up parallel rather than in the wake of the Jacobites. He can't move quite as fast with his force being so much bigger and slower, but what he's decided to do is keep parallel to ensure that the Jacobites aren't able to cut back across into the Midlands. In the coming days, and it's easiest and simplest just to show this on the strategic map that we've been using, Charles Edward moves his army generally northwest. He makes a feint towards Newbury, but then strikes into the Cotswolds towards Gloucester. Cumberland himself marches up to Newbury, and then from there, rather than trying to cut across to the Prince, he moves up to Oxford. He has political obligations too, and for some weeks Oxford was the centre of a Jacobite court. There are fines to be levied and arrests to be made in the city. Then Cumberland starts to move across towards the Jacobite position, again trying to make sure he narrows down their strategic options. Charles Edward moves his army on the 15th of April into the city of Worcester. The Jacobite occupation of Worcester isn't hindered by the presence of a small militia regiment which has simply crossed the river and blown the central arch of the bridge. But Worcester is an ill-omened place for a Scots army. It was, after all, here that in 1651 Charles II's army was destroyed by Oliver Cromwell. So it's unlikely to be a place where Charles Edward wants to linger, although in our campaign it is, if the Jacobites occupy Worcester for a week, a trigger for a rising in Wales. However, the Prince is informed that after such terrible defeats in recent weeks, the Jacobites are unlikely to be able to persuade any new supporters to rise in this area imminently. So, at Worcester, Charles Edward awakes on the 16th of April, 1746, and his fortunes have never looked bleaker, frankly. Perhaps that is because it is simply an ill-omened day. The 16th of April, 1746, historically, would have been the day that he fought the Battle of Culloden. And so you're up to date with events since the Battle of Petersfield. The middle of the month also coincides with our regular recruitment rolls, of course. A new Jacobite regiment has been raised in the lowlands of Scotland. News hasn't reached that far yet, so the recruitment rolls have not been affected by any penalties. News of the victory at Petersfield and subsequently at Littleton has spread around England, however. And so a new set of militias have sprung up at Bristol and Manchester. So the Jacobites are just ahead of their opponents. They have a little bit of time, they have a little bit of space. Maybe it's time now to ask our Council of War what they should do next. As always, thanks for watching.